You mentioned combustion appliances too, gas furnaces, even hybrid systems, which use high efficiency gas furnaces and heat pumps. Anything that burns fuel inside of a home, you have to be aware of carbon monoxide. So there's, and it's kind of a scary subject that people don't like to think about. And it's one of those situations where you never think that it could happen to you. Unless you have the proper type of monitoring, it could happen to anyone, even in an all-electric home if there's an attached garage. We just went through some ice storms and people were using gasoline-powered generators to try to keep the power going. And there's a top source of most carbon monoxide poisonings.
Or even kerosene or propane heaters, like you really should not put inside a house.
Yes.
So speak to that a little bit more about how would somebody have a carbon monoxide problem if they have a gas furnace or a dual fuel system? What would cause a carbon monoxide problem in their house?
It's one of the ways that it's termed sometimes is what's called a leak. Carbon monoxide doesn't necessarily leak, but it definitely can spill out of the equipment. And this is where you get into a problem and where you need a qualified HVAC professional that can test for those problems. There's sometimes unintentional openings and intentional openings in furnace and water heating venting systems that can allow for the relief of those flue gases. Now, that should never happen. But if it does, this is where a homeowner needs to have some type of a safety device inside their home that will alert them that carbon monoxide is present. And what many homeowners are unaware of is that a store-bought carbon monoxide alarm has a certain rating on it. And you'll see a UL2034. That's a Underwriter Laboratories rating. And it states the levels that carbon monoxide that those, alarms are allowed to be. There's also low-level carbon monoxide monitors, which are typically not sold through the store. They're sold through qualified contractors that are much higher sensitivity.
Right.
And knowing the difference between those two and how much carbon monoxide that they allow you to breathe before they go off is huge.
Right. So the sensitivity levels, the important part there, because if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot or Menards or whatever, and you just buy something off the shelf, what's typically the CO level that it's going to read before it says there's a problem here?
Yeah, well, the current standard is that it can sit in 70 parts per million or ppm of carbon monoxide for up to 4 hours before going off.
But what's the safe level?
0. It's the safe level. But you look at firefighters, any first responders, they're monitoring when they go into a home. EMTs, when they'll go in, they'll monitor the air that they breathe. And if the are 35 parts per million or above, they will immediately go back out and put on self-contained breathing apparatuses for their own safety.
So half of the level that one of these store-bought CO meters will actually tell you.
Yeah. Where low-level monitors are much more sensitive. They'll go off, they'll start to display as low as 5 parts per million and then start alarming at 15 parts per million, which is the first level that the World Health Organization has really recognized as starting to cause all kinds of problems.
Okay. So let me ask you this, I've done a lot of new construction work. I've done actually more new construction work than I have existing homes inspections. And it seems like in new construction, they only really care about having a CO monitor on the floor of the house where there might be a gas appliance. Where should the CO monitor actually be located in a house for the best results?
That's a great question. You want to make sure that it's in an area that you can see it and hear it, because many CO events will occur in the evening when the house has been shut up and most homeowners are sleeping. So you want to make sure that you can hear it and see it. And I guess an easy way to think of a difference between the store-bought carbon monoxide alarms and then the higher level sensitivity carbon monoxide monitors is kind of like security systems for your home, except these are security systems for your health. A store-bought carbon monoxide alarm will go off once an intruder, say, is in your home, standing over your bed while you're sleeping with a knife to your throat. You're in harm's way before it ever sounds. Now, a low-level carbon monoxide monitor would go off as soon as the intruder steps foot on your property and before they're ever in your home. So you would have time to respond to get the problem taken care of.
So, for example, say I've got a 2-story house with a basement and the gas furnace is located in the basement, and I have my CO detector in the basement where that gas issue may be.
Yeah.
I mean, is that the best location for it? Because if I'm sleeping on the second floor, I may or may not hear that CO monitor going off.
Right. On a multi-story home, ideally, you would have one on every floor.
Okay. So, but for the fastest response to a potential issue, do you want to have one that's close to your gas furnace or water heater as well?
For
I
fastest
assume.
response, it would, but there would be a delay. And if you're asleep, you would never hear it.
Right.
And many homeowners, when they do hear one, they're like, it's just a nuisance. And they'll take the battery out and put it in a drawer.
Why
Well,
is this
if it
thing
goes
going
off,
off?
there's a problem. Yeah, if it's going off, you need to investigate it and have a qualified professional. If they come out and only do a visual inspection on the furnace or the water heating equipment,
Mhm.
and they start giving you all kinds of opinions, that contractor is probably not qualified to handle that problem. They'll bring out a test instrument called a combustion analyzer, and that's
Mhm.
what they'll use to actually test and take the vital signs of the furnace to make sure that it's safe. So, with anything that we deal with in heating and cooling, we can test and assure that it's safe. Or if there's problems, then that'll point us in the right direction.
So, in your experience, do you see more issues with gas furnaces or gas water heaters? And there's kind of two types, right? There's a direct
Yes.
vent that goes straight to the outside with a white PVC pipe, whether it's a furnace or a water heater. And then there's what's called naturally ventilated or atmospherically ventilated, where there's a metal
Yes.
pipe and it takes the air from around that appliance and goes up into the flue and out that way. Which type of system and which type of piece of equipment is generally the most problematic, I guess?
The most problematic is the atmospherically vented that you mentioned. And part of that is because it has an opening in the venting system. And it's dependent on just natural differences in air, the air being lighter and heated for it to work correctly. The problem with that is it's very dependent on things being just right. And if something happens with the HVAC system, such as there's duct leakage or maybe a bird blocks, something happens in a roof, or maybe they block the vent.
Build a nest in it or something.
Yeah, those gases, there's no place for them to go.
Yeah.
So they will spill out that opening. And that's what they were intended for back in the 1920s. Now, thankfully, on the heating and on the heat HVAC side, most of those furnaces were actually written out of being inefficient back in the early 90s. So for gas furnaces, they haven't had those types of furnaces for a long time, but there's still a lot of them out there.
Yeah.
Boilers, you still run into those. A lot of places across the country, they still will have that opening in the venting system. And there's a potential there. If everything's working fine, then you don't have a problem. It's what happens if there's a situation and it causes the ready spill of those gases out the opening. Water
Yeah.
heaters is where you'll see the most of the problems, though.
Water heaters. Okay.
Yes.
And I would also assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a water heater flue, like the metal flue pipe on a water heater, if it's connected to the flue pipe of a furnace that's sitting next to it, where it's commonly vented,
Yes.
are those worse than one that's just vented by itself directly?
They can be, because they can affect one another, especially if the furnace is 80% or higher in efficiency. Now, not 90%, which is a condensing. It would have a PVC or a plastic flue on it.
The metal ones.
Yes, the 80% furnaces would still have a metal flue, and they have a small fan on them. And if the water heater happens to be running at the same time as the furnace, they can interfere with one another and cause intermittent issues.
Yeah. And like you said, if the furnace kicks on and maybe there's duct leakage that's happening, the system's not sealed, especially on the return side, right?
Yeah.
If you have return side duct work in a closet that's not sealed and your water heater's sitting there right next to it,
That's
and
right.
the system kicks on, it's going to suck air from that closet into the duct system, which can actually backdraft the water heater, right?
Right. And sometimes we'll unintentionally, I know we did this when I was an HVAC contractor, we would leave the filter rack open so that the homeowner could easily get to the filter and pull it out.
That's a huge one. I see that way too often.
Yes. Well, the closer you are to the furnace, the more air it pulls.
The more pressure, right?
Yes.
So talk